Hi, welcome to another episode of Start the Week with Wisdom. I'm your host, Bridget Burns with the University Innovation Alliance.
And I'm Doug Lederman, editor and co-founder of Inside Higher Ed.
Each week, Doug and I team up to have a conversation with a sitting college president or chancellor to try and distill a sense of their perspective, their wisdom, and their leadership for you to hopefully give you a little bit of inspiration and perspective for the week ahead. So that's why we call it Start the Week with Wisdom. And Weekly Wisdom is sponsored by Mainstay, which is formerly known as AdmitHub, is what you might have known them for, known them as prior. And they're a student retention and engagement platform that you might know about because of chatbots, but they do other things than that. And what I like about them is that they actually engage and participate in consistent, regular, peer-reviewed, published, studied research to make sure that they validate that their work works. And two of the publications that they have shared that, again, they work with, I think, Lindsay Page on much of this, is they validated that they've helped Georgia State reduce their summer melt by 21%, and they actually helped them hang on to 1,200 additional students that they would have normally lost. And so those are two studies that they've put forward, but they have a variety of others that they work with a variety of institutions. And if you want to hear more, you go to mainstay.com.
And this week's guest is M. Brian Blake, who's president of Georgia State University. He was appointed last summer. Before being appointed to that job, he was provost at both George Washington University and Drexel. And has worked at several private institutions before that, and is now leading a really ambitious and fast-growing public. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today.
So we're super excited to have a conversation with you. And I just wanted to first start because I think, as I was sharing with Doug earlier, I don't think people understand just how unique your presidency is, that you have this whole private sector entrepreneurial perspective that you then brought into the academy. And not only are you a distinguished scholar and done a great deal of research in the field, but I think it's really interesting to find someone who's been an entrepreneur in the private sector and then come into the academy. So we were just wondering if we could start off with you giving a little sense of that, of your career perspective and that trajectory.
Yeah, I actually have two things that have been part of my fabric coming in as a leader, as an academic, and just as a professional. My dad was an entrepreneur. So from the time I was, 1 year old, he owned several service stations. I've been kind of in that environment. I used to joke and say I was pumping gas, self-serve, full serve, when I was 8 or 9 years old. And I think by the time I was 13, I had the opportunity to start doing a lot of counting. And I think that sticks with me and kind of how I think about things. So when I finished my undergrad at Georgia Tech in engineering, I started with Lockheed Martin, and they had this program where you actually do your graduate work at the same time, engineering leadership development program. So I started that, and then I continued along that same term as actually doing my PhD while I was with Lockheed, General Dynamics, and with the MITRE Corporation. So what I thought was really good about this is that when you work in industry, I did that full time for 6 years before going to academia, deadlines and, critical path and quality and deliverables, all those things are, a part of your job in such a way that you really emphasize on them. So by the time I got into this perspective of being academia, that piece was, kind of part of how I operated. So, but I thought it was a great synergy. When I did my PhD, I could use corporate information for the data that I use for assessment. Very soon after I finished in my PhD and went on to go to Georgetown, I had 2 patents that were based on, my PhD work with the MITRE Corporation. So it was just great to kind of have that perspective. And that was like a real kickstart to my academic life.
That's great. And I don't know of any president. I'd be curious if our viewers, if there's anyone out there who's had that kind of experience. But I'm also, I think people might not understand that that Georgia State, Georgia is for you. This is a bit of a coming home for you.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious about at this part of your career, what makes that so bittersweet?
Oh, it's so special to me. My family's in town. My wife's family is also in town right now. I'm literally a product of public education in the state of Georgia. So I attended K through 8 in public school. I went to Georgia Tech, private school too. I went to Mercer University for my master's degree. So our students here remind me a great deal of myself. So I get the chance to really make impact where it all started. So that part is really exciting. And then to do it in an urban setting right here in the center of downtown Atlanta, I mean, it's a dream come true. It's really the honor, I'm humbled to get a position. It's really certainly an honor of my career to kind of be able to serve in this way.
I want to go back to the integrating the kind of corporate entrepreneurial perspective in an ecosystem that is often viewed as not necessarily acting that way, and in some ways, sometimes hostile to the corporate perspective. And I'm just curious how you've already mentioned a couple of ways where that background I think helped you. Have there been times where you've had to sort of explain yourself or to mitigate that, I'm just curious how that blend has gone.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Academia is very deliberate in its way of actually, we're scholars. Even as PhDs, we're taught to specialize, and we're taught almost in verticals in some ways. So the way we teach students is really about being thoughtful, and you want to make sure that there's deep learning. So all of those things really represent a process by which things are a little bit more deliberate, and they could feel a little bit more methodical than some things that could be maybe more agile, if you will. So I've learned, for me, I've had some times when I've used phraseology, if that's a word, that kind of pulled back from my corporate standpoint. And faculty have let me know. They were like, look, this is not a business. This is, we actually have a way of training students, and it's that deep, fermentation process that really makes the sense. And I've pulled back when I've heard that, because I understand that perspective, also having a PhD. But I'll say what I've done to mitigate that is that, you instead of thinking, there's one or two things you want to happen really fast. And sometimes it can't happen fast. So my philosophy has always been, I'm a software engineer by training. So we're taught to do large software applications by bringing together smaller parts, and then also allowing large groups of people to work at the same time. So I usually go look backwards and say, what's the vision? And then I know that's going to require us to accomplish a number of different things. So my favorite term is, 1,000 flowers blooming, because what you can do in academia, which works out really well, is that you can literally start a lot of things going. You have a lot of really smart people, students on campus. So you can set these task force and different working groups together. And if you're smart enough to kind of choreograph them in such a way that when the deliverables, when the timing's right, you can really make significant impact, and it could be well vetted. So a combination of actually going more broader than deep methodically, and then also thinking through that and attach it to a vision that the community agrees to.
I think that's super helpful for us to think about in terms of the institution and I think failing fast and how we can be more entrepreneurial. As someone who works in innovation, people are always asking, where do we get a lot of our perspective and inspiration? And there's a lot of great stuff that happens in the academy, but a lot of the idea about how we can move the cycle of innovation faster come from the private sector, from different companies and otherwise. So I'm curious about, I know that one of the priorities that you have 4 pillars that are a priority for you in this first year or so of your administration. Mm-hmm. And, but one of them is college to career, which I find really interesting. And being a software engineer, I think you probably have your finger on the pulse of challenges in the sector around how higher ed supports our students. Right. Navigating that, how we actually make sure we are meeting the demand of the workforce. Mm-hmm. And so I'm guessing that is where that came from, is that you have this unique vantage point into where higher ed could be doing a better job. Right. And that's why you're trying to expressly prioritize this and it's probably because of that unique vantage point in the software engineering.
Yeah, I think the I have one of those professions that and I'm gonna say that with huge bias, but I'm in a profession that actually there's a real great synergy between what you learn and how you exploit that when you become, no matter where you go, in government, entrepreneurship, industry, or even nonprofits. I think all of those things work really well. I mean, it seems like a software engineer is very helpful in all places. But I'd say that really, like you said, it's a foundation of thought. I just think as we are moving forward, we should address and kind of engage our students really early. And I keep thinking about our sort of athletics. There's a lot of high school to professional transitions that started about a decade or so ago. We have so many talented students that are coming in now. I just feel like we have to develop an ecosystem on our campus where students we can partner with whatever those outcomes may be, whether it's graduate school or industry or government, and recruit the students from day one, and then try to weave their path such that they go directly into those opportunities. Very similar to what we mentioned. Software engineering, computer science. We kind of, some of that's baked in, but the other paths we could probably put in some specific modules or credentials that allow our students to have just sort of immediate impact when they get into their whatever that outcome may be. So my college to careers pillar is all about creating that ecosystem here. And it's not, again, we talked about speed and of actually doing these things. Probably the first step probably isn't going and getting with a company and putting together an admissions process where we, co-recruit students. The first stage is probably developing co-branded curriculum facilities so that industry can share their problems, and actually maybe we get some industry or government officials to teach, and then we create those sort of bridge modules, and then over time we build up a relationship with to allow us to kind of engage students from the time they graduate from high school or earlier. So
so this is a topic that I cover frequently in terms of the most innovative ideas that we see in the field. And the thing that we learned at the UIA, from UCF and Georgia State, was that the one place all students go is the classroom. And so if you want to do college to career innovation, Georgia State, one thing they did was super cool and creative, and I hope other campuses replicate this, is they created these small grants for faculty to integrate career readiness into the classroom. And like very quickly, almost overnight, because faculty were given resources and time to do this, thousands of courses you were able to integrate career readiness into the classroom. And it's like, that is the path, I think, in addition to what you just talked about. It's just really from day one. You don't wait until the senior year, it's as soon as you get here. So I think that's fantastic. Sorry, we'll hop off this soapbox.
Yeah, no problem.
I think, Doug, you wanted the next question, or okay, great. I think the next piece I wanted to ask you, President Blake, is you've had we've talked about how interesting your career has been. I'm curious about what for you has been the most surprising aspect of your career, because I'm sure it seems like there's a lot of things that would be quite surprising, but for you personally, what's been most illuminating?
Yeah, for me, let's see, what would be most surprising? I don't think anyone ever quite fully understands kind of what input leads to what output. So as an engineer, you've got a left side of equation and a right side of equation. And your tendency is to say, look, I can engineer the right side to get to the left side. And it's going to be very deterministic, meaning it's what I do exactly leads to what that outcome is going to be. I didn't appreciate the influence and perspective and encouragement and kind of how you sort of building a team and team dynamics. When that was the most surprising thing to me, is that it's not that I've had some success in how we've grown our research enterprise in previous roles. And if you would have asked me this 5-10 years ago, I'd have said, oh, we just got to start the right programs and fund the right things and it'll happen. But really it was some things that happened. You smiled at the right person, or you hired the right person, or you promoted the right person, or, you recruited the right student that came up with the right idea. So and none of that stuff that you do specifically, it's just a matter of setting a framework, supporting, empowering, and being a servant leader, and then allowing your community to really shine. So I was surprised how much impact. When I went back and looked at Drexel, we had a great run in research. When I looked back and tried to map out, and this engineered me too, map out how we got there, I found that the majority of the research that really came out of it was more serendipitous than I would have thought. And it was like the one-off to the work we were doing. So I've got to the point now where I understand it's like, you gotta build a community that feels, just inspired and innovate. They feel like they can be entrepreneurial, and then don't say no as a first answer. Try to say, this is how we get to yes.
Is there a particular job or experience from your past that that sort of taught you the most about leadership and or prepared you for what you've seen in the presidency so far? I don't know if those are the same things or different things, but.
Yeah, I think my time as provost, and I'd say both of them. So I spent over 4 years, almost 4 years and a half at Drexel. And I'm going to make some attribution working under John Fry there, President John Fry. And then I spent just about 2 years working under, well, that's not fair. I've spent 2 years working under the president of GW, Tom LeBlanc, but I did work under him for 3 years prior to that, University of Miami, at a different position. So I probably had 5 years between both of them. Their styles are different. And the environments for which we operated, if you look at Miami, Drexel, then GW, they all were different. Some were more, I'd say some were more like, more collaborative and more open to change. Others were kind of more methodical, wanted kind of more justification. Some need extreme communication, and others, you could actually work with certain groups and make progress. But one thing I did find, I'd say both of those, that 10-year period, I pull so much from experience I got from both of them. I'd say you never forget your first provost position, but I'd say that I got a lot out of that because we were a comprehensive institution, medical school, engineering, middle of the city. We highly involved in civic engagement, public-private partnerships, sort of reimagining the campus to be more student engaged. So we just had like I said, 1,000 flowers were being seeded and blooming, over time. And then some, I think, bloomed after my time. So I just felt like those two positions over time were very, you always can there's always going to be challenges that, leaders have to deal with. But I'd say those two were about as I can't imagine being much more prepared from the experience I've had with President Fry and President LeBlanc.
That's great. I think, you asked that question, Doug, about, what he learned from sitting in the position. I think it says a lot that you actually, one of the things you learned was mainly you started talking about what you were learning from the exposure to others and like these other different leadership styles, because I do think we actually, it doesn't influence how we lead. My bosses that I've had very directly affect how I lead. In some cases, I lead the opposite, and because I've learned that lesson, right? And so that's an interesting perspective to think about your career trajectory in that way.
I sometimes joke about President Fry. I'm like, when you see someone else working from a different vantage point, and then you're like number two, there's times when you feel like you would make a different decision. But I'll say, I joke and say, gosh, every day I find out he's like a personal Mr. Miyagi from Karate Kid, because I was learning. I didn't know I was learning. So there's so much I see now that from those two individuals that I can look back and say, oh, now I see why they did that. So it's very, very helpful.
That's great. So this is kind of gives you an opportunity to share a bit, perhaps, about what you've learned from them. I'm curious about the advice that, as you've had this interesting career trajectory, exposure to a lot of different institutions. And I'm just curious about what advice has been most valuable someone else gave you that you consistently rely upon in your career. Can you share a little bit about like why and who?
I got this advice twice. So one was during my time at the MITRE Corporation. So MITRE, I'm a big MITRE fan. So, I'll give them a shout out. They, it was it's a FFRDC. So you a federally funded research development corporation. So you are actually an agent of the government and you are a consultant to help them with their vendors, their contractors. So a lot of your products are PowerPoint and thought pieces. So because you're trying to help make sure that they're making decisions, appropriately how they implement or how they choose vendors. But gosh, in that environment, because that is the deliverable, everyone talks about quality. I mean, your slides, how the pictures are formatted, what words you use. It's just like everything goes through this machine of being like the highest quality possible. And it over, I was there 7-8 years. So it gets ingrained to you that when you deliver something, you always deliver in high quality. That's just because that's your deliverable. So it took a while. I'm a software engineer, I computer programmer first, Mountain Dew and Nerd Candies is what I dealt in for the first part of my career, just programming long hours. So it took me a while to get into that perspective, but that was helpful. And then I'll talk about Peter Freeman. He was one of the first dean of computing at Georgia Tech. Later, he was associate director for computer information systems and engineering at the National Science Foundation. I remember one time I spoke with him and I was like, and I was considering job opportunities. And I gave him this long list of both of them, hoping that he'd just say, go to this one or that one. And his final words were like, just do everything at the highest quality you can. And that was like, sort of his response to it. And I'll tell you, many of my opportunities to date are because someone remembered something I did that was really high quality. So I always tell people and our students, I'm like, look, just concentrate on quality. Everything else will fall in place. So that's probably the best advice. And I've tried my best. You can't always do things perfect, but if you can do it as with as much thoughtfulness as you can before you let it go out the door, people always remember that.
That's super. I mean, it's incredibly, that is on the nose. That would what we want people to do. I guess my last question then for you is, if that's the advice you also find yourself passing on to others, are there any books that have been particularly valuable for you, or anything that for you as a leader that I'm looking over here and I have like Speed of Trust sitting here on my desk. So I'm curious if there's any books that you often recommend to people to read as you're trying to help support them in their leadership journey.
Yeah, and I get asked this often, and I got to say, I've been from the time I started as a professor, I spent so much time in technical journals that I didn't spend a lot of time reading other books. And then by the time I got into provost and presidency, I spent a lot of time reading about academic leadership, whether that's through articles. And now I've got to do more reading on current events. And so in that vein, I'll just say what's the last thing I read was about a year ago. Steve Trachtenberg was the long-term president at GW, and he's a character. I hope he sees this, but he took a real just a great guy. I mean, I came into GW at a time when there was really a lot of commotion at that point, and he was the type of person that would send me these emails and say, "Don't worry about that. Don't worry about this. Keep doing that. Keep doing this." But one of the books and then he went to lunch with me a couple of times. He gave me his feedback of being a president, but he actually recommended a book, Presidencies Derailed, which is his personality as well. So I read that one. That was an excellent read, particularly coming into a presidency to kind of see a couple of different perspectives on the role and, kind of get your feet wet. So I would say that's not for everyone. Although I think it transcends academia, but I would recommend that for academics who could imagine being a president at some point.
Yeah, I mean, as immediately as you say, I was like, do not renovate the house, do not renovate your office. There are some obvious ones that we've all seen time and time again.
Indeed.
Well, President Blake, this has been a real delight to just get to know you a bit more personally. I know that folks are going to get a chance to hear from you and quite a bit over the coming years. And as a leader at Georgia State, which we all know is the national model on student success, often we'll be focusing our conversation to that topic. But I just wanted to try and learn a little bit more about your journey, because I do think it's important with this show that we elevate different journeys to the presidency. And because I think that we have this traditional idea of what the steps are and the backgrounds that are represented. And I think the future is going to require that we have a real multitude of perspectives that are brought into leadership in higher ed. So I'm very excited about that. So thanks so much. And Doug, as always, thanks for being an excellent co-host, and we will see you all next week. Thanks so much.
Thank you both.
Take care.